Irritator is a strange spinosaur known from the greater 2/3 of a very well-preserved skull, and only some bits and pieces of the body. It has had a long, convoluted, and controversial history of colonialism, forgery, and reanalysis. A brand new study, now blipped from its own journal, finds that it had a very strange ability to swallow huge things in one gulp. Spinosaurs are one of the most interesting groups of theropod dinosaurs, aside from birds. They have experienced a major shift in their perception over the decades as more and more fossils are found. They went from potentially fish-eating normal theropods to some of the weirdest and gawkiest dinosaurs ever known, with the potential for underwater foraging of all sorts of aquatic goodies. The group even contains one of the largest carnivorous dinosaurs to ever live, Spinosaurus. Whereas most other giant carnivorous theropod dinosaurs have the characteristics of predators that take down prey items larger than them, the Spinosaurs seem well suited to capturing much smaller prey, mostly, if not predominantly, fish. Despite all that is now known about the Spinosaurs, most are quite fragmentary, with plenty of pieces missing from their noggins. On top of that, some of the most important specimens that contain some elements that are often missing in other Spinosaurs have only been given preliminary or short descriptions. If you don't know, this is mostly referring to Suchomimus, which has not seen a full-scale description of its fossils since it was first described. The missing noggins, or superfragmentary noggins of most Spinosaurs, offer a huge problem for how these dinosaurs are reconstructed. Spinosaurus's bits were blasted to kingdom come. Sigilmassasaurus is a neck, Siamosaurus is teeth, then there were the few bits of Suchomimus. The next best and most complete skull came from the holotype of Baryonyx. Some more skull pieces have been recently described and named as Rhiperovenator and Ceratopsuchops. So, outside of all this, the next most complete Spinosaur skull belongs to the Brazilian Irritator. This Spinosaur comes from the Araripe Basin of northeastern Brazil. Brazil has stringent laws against exporting their fossil heritage for pretty much any reason. Despite this, there is an illegal fossil black market that has resulted in the selling of specimens of all sorts of critters, like Ubirajara, Tupandactylus navigans, and many others to all sorts of buyers the world over. This industry often forces the fossil poachers to reconstruct, break, and obscure parts of the bones they find to make them more valuable to potential buyers. That's what happened to a moderately well-preserved skull of a Spinosaur bought and essentially stolen by the State Museum of Natural History in Stuttgart, Germany, back in the mid to late 1990s. It was originally thought to be the skull of a pterosaur by those who found it and sold it, those who bought it, and by the team of researchers who first described it. It took other researchers to point out how theropod-like it was for the original team to update their identification. This team, which included now infamously unethical bad actors David Martil and Eberhard Frey, but also Arthur Cruikshank, Philip Small, and Maria Clark, described the skull as Irritator Challengeri, due to the irritation caused when trying to identify what was real and what was plaster, and due to the character Professor Challenger from the Lost World book. The original author team, whose overall ethics are unknown to me besides Martil and Frey, examined the skull by CT scanning it. With that procedure, they were able to find that the upper jaw was artificially elongated when whoever found and prepared it stuck the jaw bones to the snout. The skull is otherwise relatively well preserved, aside from some warping and breakage, and is missing the tip of the snout and the frontmost bones of the lower jaw. Thanks to the poor quality of CT scan tech at the time, a lot of the bone's surface details were unable to be picked up. That was until a brand new study published in May of 2023 by Marco Schade, Oliver Rauhat, Christian Foth, Olaf Mullman, and Sherjosha Evers decided to throw the specimen's CT data and a new set of CT data published by Marco Schade, Oliver Rauhat, and Sherjosha Evers in 2020 through a newer technique called digital segmentation. This allowed the team to digitally reconstruct the individual bones of the skull, rearrange them, and mirror missing elements. A 3D digital model of the most complete Spinosaurus skull known to science, showing all of the ranges of motion for each skull bone, providing insight into the biomechanics of Spinosaurus skulls. One of the major insights found from this reanalysis and digital reconstruction was the posture at which the animal held its head on average when it was alive. The ear bones were preserved in the skull, the lateral semicircular canals in the endosteus labyrinth, as was the occipital condyle, the ball of bone on the back of the skull that connected the noggin to the neck. The head was held at a near 45-degree habitual tilt, but the brain was still horizontal relative to this dipping snout. The skull was reconstructed based on what was seen in the individual bones. This resulted in a rather more Spinosaurus-like skull than something resembling Baryonyx and Suchomimus. That's to be expected, but there seemed to be a moderately tall, thin crest of bone running along the snout, as can be seen in the 3D printed skulls produced by the author team. Another major revelation from this study was the functional anatomy of the animal's jaws. Firstly, the jaw muscles were estimated and reconstructed here in this diagram based on the size and shape of the muscle scars etched into the bones, as well as those muscles seen in reptiles, crocs, and birds. The articulation between the quadrate bone of the skull and the syringular bone of the lower jaws backs up what was proposed for Spinosaurs in years past, that these animals' jaws spread out into the sides when they were depressed. When the jaws open, they rotate outwards. Now, the tips of the lower jaws of Irritator are not preserved, so it technically remains unknown precisely how the whole contraption would look when the animal snapped its jaws open. Plenty of paleoartists have jumped the gun and shown this action as though the jaws were like snakes. An elastic band in between the tips of the lower jaws allow them to essentially dislocate from one another when opened, creating a bigger surface area. Unfortunately for the isle enthusiasts out there, and though the preserved lower jaw tips of other Spinosaurs do indicate some sort of ligament connecting the tips, the snake jaws are highly unlikely. You see, this sort of adaptation is unique to squamates, the lizards and snakes, and is only common among a few lizards. Birds, crocs, turtles, and mammals cannot unhook the tips of their jaws and spread them open for swallowing wide loads. However, plenty of birds are able to bend their lower jaws to create a wider opening, such as the pelican. This is the most likely interpretation of the rotating jaws. The authors hypothesized that all of these characteristics were adaptations for predation on small prey items, smaller than Irritator's body size. It is highly likely these animals employed ambush hunting techniques to quickly snap their jaws open and outwards to catch slippery fish that their long, fluted, conical teeth punctured with ease.
Controversy.
Here is the statement provided by the authors of the paper, more or less word for word. As the specimen described here originates from Brazil, and there currently is a debate about the legality and ethics of working with Brazilian specimens deposited outside of this country, we acknowledge the possibly problematic status of SMNS 58022. Thus, we want to present some background and considerations on this matter. The type specimen of Irritator Challenger Eye was purchased by the Stalichtes Museum für Naturkunde, Stuttgart, from a German fossil dealer in 1991. The specimen was imported to Germany prior to 1990 when the decree on the export of fossils and the handling of type specimens from Brazil was passed. The previous legislation in Brazil from March of 1942 governs the need of permits for the collection of specimens, but not their export. Most fossils from the Arraripe Basin are collected and sold by local collectors. David Martill has mentioned that local collectors recalled seeing the specimen, later becoming the holotype of Irritator challengeri, so that it is likely that it was purchased from such collectors prior to its export. Currently, as part of the collection of the Stalakti's Museum für Naturkunde Stuttgart, the specimen is property of the German Bundesland province of Baden-Württemberg, and a clarification of its legal status lies neither within our nor the local curator's power. Since the acquisition of the specimen by the Stalakti's Museum für Naturkunde Stuttgart, it has been studied repeatedly. The new taxon, Irritator challengeri, was established and initially described by Martill and others in 1996, with additional information having been provided by Seuss and others 2002, Hendricks and others 2016 and 2019, Sales and Schultz 2017, and Shade and others 2020. As the specimen is part of a public collection and thus available for additional study for anybody with a scientific interest in it, we provide new information here. In order to make our data available to the broader scientific community, we already deposited the available neuroanatomical models and CT data, a medical CT of the entire skull and a micro-CT of the brain case in the online repository Morphosource in the framework of our previous publication on the endocranial anatomy of Irritator. These CT data, which also form the basis for the current work, are freely available for download from that platform. All new 3D models created from that data, in addition to photogrammetric models of the fossil, are also deposited on Morphosource. A few days to a week after this paper was published through Paleontologica Electronica, the journal dumped the paper in a similar though unique way to the Ubirajara paper being pulled shortly after publication. Matas Hisny, executive director of the scientific journal Paleontologica Electronica, announced the dropping of the study after being informed about the controversy surrounding the fossil's status. The criticisms of the international scientific community about smuggling and the lack of clarity on this point in the study was provided by the G1 Science website. Quote,
"First of all, we would like to make it clear that our journal fully supports the idea of repatriation of Brazilian fossils,"
Matas Hisny told G1. According to statements made on their Twitter profiles, two researchers involved in the study, Serjosha Evers and Olof Molmund, also support the repatriation of the fossil. The head of the research, German paleontologist Marco Shade, told G1 that since Brazil and Germany are constitutional democracies with diplomatic connections to each other, a contact between the governments of both countries is needed to evaluate the return of the material. Quote,
"We propose that the responsible Brazilian authorities contact the respective institutions in Germany to investigate and determine the legal status of the SMNS 58022 specimen and discuss a possible repatriation,"
Shade said. In addition, Hisny pointed out that the study's authors are in contact with Paul Stewins, a paleontologist and lawyer involved in the case of the Ubirajara jubatus fossil, the smuggling of which came to light in 2020. Stewins suggested through his social networks that an initiative be launched to repatriate the case, and if this occurs, the journal considers supporting. Quote,
"If such an initiative is born, Paleontologica Electronica is thinking of joining. For now, the study on Irritator published in our journal has been taken down and is not accessible at the moment. We are currently talking to the parties involved. We can provide more information once the situation is resolved,"
the executive director concluded. I would next like to go over what Dr. Aline Gilardi, professor at the geology department at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte in Natal, Rio Grande do Norte, Brazil, said in regard to the paper and the repatriation of the fossils to Brazil. Sad to see some colleagues from the global south with their minds tamed by the colonizer supporting speeches that demonize Brazilians simply for protesting what is theirs over something that was illegally taken from us. Saying things like, "That's no way to ask, you have to ask politely," is an attempt to domesticate the oppressed. Something was taken unjustly and illegally from us, and we have to ask politely for its return? Oh please, dear colonizer, could you please return that? I have been a good girl, can we have that back now? It is normal that protests generate friction. This is how we can warn about a problem and effectively change things. Otherwise, nobody pays attention. We've been saying the same thing for years in a polite way. Nothing has happened. We have run out of patience. I saw a lot of people from the global north saying that we should behave and act politely. I agree that some specific attacks are not nice, but the protests are perfectly valid, and it is absolutely understandable the irritation, see what I did there, of Brazilian people. The constant engagement of Brazilians in any message that mentions work is important because this gives visibility to the protest. It draws attention to the problem. If you are bothered by this, I am sorry, but you are in a comfort zone and you need to pay more attention to the world around you. If you are bothered, it is because you are a person of privilege who is feeling hurt because others are fighting for space. Think a little, try to understand the historical context and have empathy. Asking for moderation in tone is as counterproductive as making personal attacks. If instead you showed empathy and alignment with the cause, naturally the tone would moderate because we would feel heard. To only criticize the tone of the protest is just a way of saying that you are against our fight for the decolonization of science, and you are terrified of losing your privileges. Now, another important point that should be commented on, those who are from the paleo community and don't comment on things like hashtag Ubirahara belongs to Brazil and hashtag Irritator belongs to BR, have already made their position very clear. Ignoring this shows your utter contempt for the cause. Okay, so now some of you may find this harsh, as I admittedly did when I first read it without the enlightening context of the ethics statement provided by the paper, its dropping from the journal, and the context of the story of the fossil itself. As Dr. Gilardi said, there is no reason for anyone to be mad at those causing a ruckus about the paper or its use of stolen fossils. Though it is not the purview of this most recent research team to get the fossil where it belongs, they are inadvertently or advertently profiting from the spoils of colonialism. The Brazilian scientists have every right to be mad and are correct, and should keep saying it. I do wonder if that means scientists from their respective countries should always have a monopoly on their fossils and the research and publication of research on these fossils. I think context is the most important thing here, as the US was historically founded on imperialism and colonialism, so our fossils may not be as rightfully ours as the Brazilian fossils are rightfully theirs. Then again, their fossils are directly and illegally pillaged from their country, whereas the US doesn't really care about its natural heritage in even the slightest, selling it off to the highest bidder. Moral issue? Maybe. Legal issue? No. A legal and a moral issue with regard to Brazil and its fossil heritage. I don't think this discussion therefore also requires that only Brazilians may research their own fossils, nor does it mean that only Brazilians can dig and recover their own fossils. Mongolia does something similar, in which it is illegal to sell any of their own fossils. Most Mongolian fossils taken by the American Museum of Natural History have since been returned, and so have those that have been caught by law enforcement, hence the Nicolas Cage Tarbosaurus incident. Thankfully, people are waking up to these things with the return of the Ubirajara specimen to Brazil already, or within a few weeks or days. Researchers there will have their hands full trying to get information out on this specimen. It seems that a campaign for Irritator is already in full swing. Let us hope it gets to return. Keep using the hashtag IrritatorBelongs2BR to bring continued attention to this issue. For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, like this video, drop a comment in the comment section below, and hit the bell icon to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to Elephant Tier patrons Abby Smith, Arda Bayer, Biotaverse, Cherry Shaw, Chris Frampton, Christoph Hubbinger, Dinosaur, Ed Peretz, Isaiah Garza, Jax the Hacks, Natty Cat, PA Brew News, Ray, Rudy Redgrave, Smiling Walrus, Staniforth Hopkins, Steve Bradshaw, Thea Svensson, and Extraterrestrial. As well as my top tier Tyrannosaurus patrons, Admin, Antron, Aphid Kirby, Cyber, Dana Manchester, Danny Van Heck, Henry Brennan, Iberospinus, Iron Bladesman, Joshua Mana, Panic, Radio 404, Robert Kessler, Ruben Zachariah, Swaffles is Weird, Teeny Dragator, and The Dogman.